Every empire leaves a shadow. Every shadow hides a story. Welcome to Shadows of the Past.
The storm that changed history. Long before the name Christopher Columbus appeared in history books, the cold northern seas were ruled by fearless sailors known as the Vikings. These explorers came from the rugged lands of Norway, Iceland, and Greenland. They were warriors, traders, and above all, explorers who believed the ocean was not a barrier but a road to new worlds. Among these Vikings was a young man who would unknowingly change the story of history. His name was Leif Erikson. Leif was the son of the famous Viking leader, Eric the Red, the man who founded the Viking settlements in Greenland. Growing up, Leif heard endless stories of distant lands across the sea, lands of forests, rivers, and fertile soil. These stories filled his mind with curiosity and ambition, but one mysterious event would push him toward an extraordinary journey. Around the year 1000 AD, a Viking sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing toward Greenland when a powerful storm blew his ship far off course. For days, thick fog and violent waves surrounded his vessel. When the skies finally cleared, saw something strange on the horizon, land. But it wasn't Greenland. The land looked different, covered with thick forests and long stretches of coastline. Bjarni had discovered something unknown, but, strangely, he never stepped ashore. Instead, he turned his ship around and returned to Greenland. When Bjarni told his story, many Vikings were fascinated, but one man became obsessed: Leif Erikson. Leif listened carefully as Bjarni described the mysterious land, forests, hills, and fertile ground, something Greenland lacked. The idea of a new land with excitement. Leif. He made a bold decision. Leif bought Bjarni's ship and began preparing for an expedition into the unknown. His goal was simple: find the mysterious land that Bjarni had seen. Leif gathered a small crew of around 35 Viking sailors. These men were brave explorers who trusted their leader and were willing to risk their lives on the dangerous Atlantic Ocean. The Vikings built one of their legendary longships, a fast and flexible vessel designed for long sea voyages, with supplies, weapons, and determination. From Greenland into the cold and unpredictable ocean. The journey was dangerous. Massive waves crashed against the ship. Freezing winds howled across the sea. Nights were long and dark, and no one knew what days turned into weeks. Then one morning, something appeared on the horizon. Land. The crew rushed to the front of the ship as Leif stared toward the coastline. The land looked rocky and barren. There were no forests, only flat stones stretching across. Leif named this place Helluland, meaning land of flat stones. Historians believe this land may have been part of modern-day Canada, possibly near Baffin Island. But Leif wasn't satisfied. He believed there was more land further south, so the Vikings sailed again. After several more days at sea, another coastline appeared. This land looked very different. Thick forests covered the hills, and the air smelled of fresh pine trees. Leif called this place Markland, meaning forest land. This discovery excited the Vikings. Timber was extremely valuable for building ships, yet Leif continued sailing. He believed the true discovery still lay ahead. Weeks later, the Viking ship reached a land unlike anything they had ever seen. The air was warmer. Rivers through green valleys, wild grapes grew across the hills. To the Vikings, it felt like paradise. Stepped onto the shore and looked across the vast wilderness. He had reached a new world that would later become part of North America. Leif named it Vinland, the land of wine, because of the grapes growing there. Centuries later, archaeologists would discover Viking remains at Meadows, proving that Vikings had indeed reached America nearly 500
Leif
years
Erikson's
before
discovery
Columbus was only the beginning. What happened next in Vinland would become one of the most fascinating and mysterious chapters in Viking history, and the Vikings were not alone in this new land. The new world of Vinland. When Leif Erikson and his crew stepped onto the unfamiliar shores of Vinland, they realized they had discovered something extraordinary. The land looked nothing like the icy and barren world of Greenland they had left behind. Here, the air was softer
Rivers
and warmer.
flowed
Through green valleys. Forests stretched endlessly
with
across
tall trees,
the hills, perfect for building ships and homes. The ground was rich and wild grapes grew across the land, something the Vikings had never seen before in the northern regions. To them, this place felt almost magical. Leif ordered his crew to explore the surrounding area. Small groups carefully moved through the forests, discovering fresh water streams, wild animals, of fish along the coastline. One thing quickly this land had everything a settlement needed. Food was abundant, timber was everywhere. The climate was much more comfortable than Greenland's harsh winters. Leif realized that Vinland could become an important Viking colony. Soon the crew began building small wooden shelters near the shore. Using axes and Viking tools, they cut down trees and constructed simple houses made from timber and turf. These structures would later become some of the earliest European buildings ever built in North America. Today, historians believe this settlement was located at Meadows, the only confirmed Viking site discovered in North America. But as the Vikings settled into their new environment, they began to notice something strange. This land did not seem empty. While exploring deeper into the forests, some of Leif's men found signs that someone else had already been living there. They saw footprints, strange tools, and signs of fires had recently been used. The Vikings slowly realized something important. They were not the first humans here. The land was already home to indigenous people who had lived there for thousands of years. The Vikings called them Skrælings. Historians believe these people may have been ancestors of the Inuit or other Native American tribes living in the region. At first, the Vikings were cautious. They didn't know whether these people were friendly or dangerous. For several days, nothing happened. The Vikings remained their work building shelters and gathering food. But one morning, everything changed. As the sun rose over the coastline, Viking explorers noticed movement in the distance. Small boats were approaching the shore. Inside, never seen before, people the Vikings they wore clothing made from animal skins and carried simple tools and weapons. Curiosity, their faces also showed caution. The Vikings, the newcomers, slowly approached the shore as, for a moment, both completely different worlds had. Leif Erikson just understood the importance of this moment. He knew that peace would be the best outcome for everyone. Attempted something simple, trade. They offered small items such as red cloth, metal tools in exchange, and other local Viking people goods. Offered animal furs and food. Were peaceful. At first, both sides seemed curious about each other's cultures. By the knowledge these Vikings had about the land. Tribes were fascinated by Viking ships and iron tools. For a short time, a place of cooperation became new and unknown land is never guaranteed. As more Vikings arrived in Vinland in the following years, tensions slowly began to grow. Misunderstandings, fear, and problems between the two groups started creating. The Vikings were skilled warriors, but they were also from home thousands of miles away from their nearest settlements, and the land were many. This one small mistake changed everything. Leif Erikson's dream of building a permanent Viking colony in North America was about to face its greatest. The peaceful days of Vinland would not last forever. Soon, the Vikings would learn that discovering a new world was much easier, and the conflicts that followed would eventually force them to make a difficult decision, one that would turn Vinland into a Viking empire rather than a rising. In Vinland, for a short time, life in Vinland Viking seemed almost perfect. The land provided everything they needed. Fish filled the rivers, forests offered endless timber, and The soil was rich enough for farming. Compared to the harsh environment of Greenland, Vinland felt like a paradise. The small settlement founded by Leif Erikson slowly grew stronger. Viking explorers continued to travel between Greenland and Vinland, bringing new settlers, supplies, and livestock. Among the later explorers who arrived was a wealthy Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni. He believed Vinland could become a permanent Viking colony and decided to bring a much larger group of settlers. Karlsefni arrived with several ships and women, bringing around 100 men and supplies needed to build a thriving settlement. The Vikings expanded their houses, explored deeper into the land, and began establishing. Were still strangers in a land that already belonged to others. The indigenous people, whom the Vikings called Skrellings, continued to appear around the settlement. At first, trade between the two groups continued peacefully. The Vikings exchanged red cloth, metal tools, and small items in return for valuable animal furs and local food. However, cultural differences soon began creating tension. The Vikings did not fully understand the customs of the local tribes. Likewise, the indigenous people were suspicious of these strange newcomers in their land with large ships and unfamiliar weapons. One small misunderstanding could quickly turn dangerous. According to the old Viking sagas, the tension between the two groups began to grow. During a trading encounter, the indigenous traders became especially interested in the red cloth that the Vikings offered. The cloth was bright, something they had never seen before. At first, the Vikings traded fairly, but as arguments began to break out, more people wanted the cloth. Eventually refused to trade weapons. These powerful this decision may have angered the locals them. Then one day, everything changed. A group of indigenous warriors Vikings suddenly appeared. They carried weapons. The Norse moved quickly across the fields towards. They were under attack. Chaos erupted. Viking settlers grabbed their shields and swords as arrows began flying through the air. Women and children rushed inside the wooden houses while the warriors prepared to defend. Although the Vikings were experienced fighters, they were heavily outnumbered. The indigenous warriors knew the land far forests better. The fight moved quickly through the. Eventually, Vikings managed to drive the attackers away. But the message was clear. Vinland was no longer safe. The Viking settlers now understood that surviving in this new land would not be easy. They were thousands of miles away from their home in Greenland and surrounded by groups who were beginning to see them as invaders. More attacks